given what the government has said in relation to the safeguard mechanism and therefore, I guess, limiting how much it can drive industrial emissions down, given the limitations around agricultural emissions and the ability to drive those down, it really does make transport a crucial play here, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's the right way to think about it, Kieran. We don't have a lot of movement across the different sectors. So state government action is driving electricity emissions down significantly over the next decade, and that's in fact where most of the emissions reductions are going to come from, with the other sectors staying constant. And the government's got a scare campaign out saying no taxes. So you can't touch industrial emissions, you obviously can't touch agriculture. That leaves transport. Light vehicle transport's around 11% of our emissions. So that's a big chunk, right, of our emissions that we can affect with government policy, and that's squarely the responsibility of the federal government. So it's certainly good to see both the opposition and the government come out, recognise that this is an important area where we can drive our emissions reductions, and certainly from the government side, good to see them talking positively about something so important.
Advocates for change in this space have said this policy today is underwhelming. Do you agree?
Relative to where we were 3 years ago, it's a big distance, right? We've come a long way. And so I think that should be welcomed. Certainly having the government support charging infrastructure is a great idea. Something the opposition has proposed as well. Fantastic to see that either way, after the next election, we'll see a big investment there. A lot of people have proposed big subsidies. I tend to be, against those because I think they're very expensive forms of emissions reduction. But regardless, I think what we really lack here, in fact, also from the Labor side, but in general, is we're lacking really something that'll move the needle in favour of electric vehicles. And I think what we need to be thinking about is every year that we delay that transition is another year where we have 50 million tonnes of emissions go into the air out of tailpipes. And so regardless of what the answer is, I think we need to get a lot more serious about this. And certainly 30% electric vehicle coverage in 2030 is way too low and significantly below what other countries are committing to. Some countries committing, like the UK, to completely eliminate internal combustion engine vehicles by that date. So I'd like to see a bit more ambition. I'd like to see a recognition that incentives and constraints are going to be a really important part of this task, which in general for the government, they're just not willing to talk about.
So in that balance of incentives and constraints, there's one which you've written about, I know, a number of times in recent months, including today in the Financial Review, in relation to vehicle emissions standards as a constraint, but one widely adopted. It's being widely adopted. So how does that leave us in a scenario where our biggest trading partners are adopting tougher vehicle emissions standards, but we don't?
Yeah, that's exactly the way to think about it, Kieran. Other countries are moving. So most countries in places like the US and Europe, what they do is they tell car makers that on average across your vehicle fleet, you have to reach a certain level of emissions. Like you can't just have gas guzzlers. And so that forces all of these companies across the world to favour EV sales, right? And so that's what's moved the needle over there. That's what's got the scale going. Now, if Australia doesn't, it's costly then. In America, they want to sell those EVs. They're not going to sell them here because they don't get any benefit from doing that, right? So it does lead to this weird situation where Australia doesn't have the available models, right, that other countries have. So we have significantly less choice as consumers in the Australian marketplace because our government isn't keeping up with other countries. So, whether we did it with a subsidy or whether we did it through some limits, some explicit limits to say you need to achieve a certain level of, EV coverage over the certain time frame, something just to kind of tip the balance so that we get this transition moving. And I would love to see, I think Labor was right to say 50% EVs by 2030. I'd love to see that even higher. The point is we need policy to move the needle, and that's, I think, what we're lacking at the moment.
Even without that, though, is there a scenario where those policies are undertaken by our big trading partners, by the countries where we import a lot of cars from, and that transition happens by stealth, happens anyway?
Well, there's no doubt about that. Certainly, the fact that EVs are available in Australia today has nothing to do with Australian government policy, right? And a lot of car companies today are saying, Volkswagen, for example, the current Golf is the last internal combustion engine Golf ever. Range Rover just released a new Range Rover. We're never going to build another Range Rover with another engine after this. So the transition is inevitable, but it is going to be slow. And there's all sorts of countries in the world that don't have these aggressive emission standards. And there is this potential for, the dumping ground idea where, countries that don't have those standards, don't have policies in favor of EVs, end up having those models forced upon them. So I don't think we should go crazy. I think, throwing huge amounts of money at this wouldn't be prudent, but that doesn't mean we should do nothing. And I think certainly to get that range and to get it quicker than we might otherwise get it, I think the government should tip it in favour. And again, if you delayed the EV transition in Australia by 5 years, that would result in 250 million tonnes more emissions in the air than would otherwise be there, which is 6 months of our entire emissions, right? So bringing that forward is a good idea. It would benefit, the climate, and again, is going to require action by the government.
Particularly when other sectors are limited in what
no other
they
way
can
to do it.
achieve,
Yep,
as you
exactly
argued earlier. Yeah, Professor Hamilton, great to see you. Talk to you soon.
Cheers, Kieran.